The world was caught off guard when Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, suddenly appeared on a globally televised broadcast with an expression the public had rarely seen, one that looked less like political calculation and more like the weight of revelation. The usual Israeli flag stood behind him, flanked by military advisors and senior intelligence officials. But what truly sent shockwaves across political circles wasn't the room or the expression. It was the name that came out of his mouth. In the opening lines of the address, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The moment was surreal. Commentators froze mid-analysis. Newsrooms scrambled to verify the transcription. Was Netanyahu really referring to the 36-year-old interim president of Burkina Faso? A military captain who had risen from obscurity to become one of Africa's most unshakable nationalist voices? The cameras didn't cut away. The feed was real. The words were deliberate. Netanyahu began by saying, "There are moments in international affairs when the truth must not only be spoken, but faced no matter how uncomfortable." And then he continued, citing operations conducted in the Sahel region that, according to him, had unintended consequences. At that moment, the geopolitical earth beneath Africa shifted. This was no routine diplomatic statement. This was a message laced with more than just formality. It felt like a man, long trained in the politics of power, standing in the middle of a chessboard after an unexpected check. And the man holding that check wasn't a general from a G7 country, it was Captain Traoré. A man with no nuclear arsenal, no seat at the UN Security Council, but a movement behind him that had turned him into something far more dangerous, a symbol of post-colonial defiance. Back in Burkina Faso, the streets erupted. Crowds gathered around televisions, radios, and mobile devices. Cities like Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso, people were chanting, dancing, and stunned all at once. It wasn't just the apology that resonated, it was the fact that an African military leader, often dismissed by Western media as a mere junta head, had compelled one of the most media-savvy global leaders to issue a direct statement on live TV. But this wasn't a moment born overnight. Behind Netanyahu's carefully scripted words was an undercurrent of pressure. Intelligence leaks had already started surfacing online weeks before. A failed operation near the eastern Burkina Faso gold corridors had raised suspicions. According to insiders, an Israeli-linked tech firm had been providing reconnaissance support to a private, Western entity operating in the area without the knowledge or consent of the Burkina government. Traoré's forces had intercepted a transmission and decoded the embedded signal structures, eventually leading them to a makeshift satellite relay. The implications were too large to ignore. It wasn't just about gold. It was about influence, about access, about undermining African control over its own resources. Diplomatic whispers had been growing. African leaders, once cautious about confronting Israel, publicly started aligning quietly behind Traoré. Secret communiques were exchanged. Intelligence documents began flowing into briefings. By the time Netanyahu stood in front of those cameras, he wasn't just issuing a statement. He was trying to control a narrative that was slipping through his fingers. Yet, even more chilling than the apology was the look in Netanyahu's eyes in acknowledgement that the era of unchallenged external interventions was beginning to fracture. And that fracture was made visible by a man half his age, standing thousands of miles away, armed not with missiles or money, but with legitimacy rooted in the rage of the people and the ruins of a betrayed continent. The broadcast ended, but the world did not return to normal. Something permanent had changed. The apology echoed not only through microphones, but through history itself. Something was coming, and the ones used to issuing orders were now being made to explain. It began like any other political broadcast from Tel Aviv, scheduled without warning and announced only an hour before it went live. Yet within moments of appearing on screen, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's tone and body language sent tremors through every newsroom, diplomatic office, and intelligence war room across continents. There were no preambles, no patriotic flourishes, no predictable rhetoric. Just a deep pause, and then one mnemon expected, potent and electric. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. The world blinked. The silence that followed in homes, studios, and embassies was not of confusion, it was of disbelief. Ibrahim Traoré, the revolutionary from Burkina Faso, the soldier president who rose not through decades of diplomacy, but in a matter of months. Fueled by the frustrations of a continent long treated like a chessboard. For a sitting Israeli Prime Minister to mention him directly, live without filters, was not just historic, it was seismic. Analysts frantically adjusted their commentaries. Satellite channels switched to live coverage. Africa sat upright. The Sahel was listening. Netanyahu's expression wasn't that of a politician delivering a stern warning or asserting geopolitical authority. It was the expression of a man cornered by a truth too vast to hide and too dangerous to deny. His first few sentences hinted at something more than diplomacy. He spoke of operations that had crossed unintended boundaries, actions that had caused concern, and intelligence activities that may have lacked proper oversight. But the world didn't need to read between the lines. The lines themselves were breaking. A major power was admitting to misconduct indirectly. But undeniably, what followed wasn't merely a statement, it was the unraveling of a secret. For weeks, Traoré's inner circle had been quietly broadcasting breadcrumbs, encrypted tweets, obscure press briefings, and veiled references to foreign footprints in Burkina territory. Something had been building, something shadowy, yet real. And now, here was the confirmation. The Israeli Prime Minister was speaking not just to the people of Israel, but to Africa, and more specifically, to the leader of a landlocked nation, the global elite once viewed as geopolitically irrelevant. But Burkina Faso was no longer quiet. Under Traoré, it had become the epicenter of a growing storm against neo-colonial interference. He had expelled French forces, resisted World Bank pressures, and had begun to centralize gold trade through national structures. These weren't isolated moves, they were part of a doctrine. In Israel, in coordination with unnamed Western partners, had been trying to quietly navigate around it. But Traoré was ahead of them. Sources would later reveal that an Israeli-affiliated surveillance project had embedded itself near a critical energy corridor in the east. It operated under the pretense of anti-terror reconnaissance. Traoré's military intelligence caught wind of anomalized equipment not matching humanitarian specs, transmissions heading west instead of north, and flight paths that seemed to ignore declared no-fly zones. What his forces uncovered wasn't just surveillance. It was data harvesting, resource mapping, and the use of advanced AI to predict resistance movements. A modern form of digital colonization right under Africa's nose. Netanyahu's speech, cloaked in apologetic diplomatic language, was actually an attempt to contain a wildfire. We acknowledge that certain intelligence activities may have overstepped bilateral agreements, he said, as if phrasing alone could neutralize the damage. But the damage had already been done. In real time, social media erupted. African journalists, thinkers, and citizens dissected every line. And in the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré remained off-camera, silent, listening. He didn't need to respond yet. The world was already watching. And more importantly, the world had just witnessed something rare. One of the most powerful states on earth, speaking the name of a young African leader, not as an adversary, not as a puppet, but as a force to be reckoned with. The apology, whether sincere or strategic, marked a turning point. Not in Netanyahu's career, but in Traoré's story, and in Africa's claim to be heard. The meeting took place in total secrecy, shielded from the eyes of the international press and conducted under layers of diplomatic smoke. The location, Accra, Ghana, neutral ground chosen for its political stability and regional influence. Inside a private wing of a fortified government complex, two delegations faced each other across a long mahogany table. On one side sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, composed, focused, and flanked by top intelligence and defense officials. On the other, a group of senior Israeli intermediary seasoned diplomats and discreet intelligence handlers known only by first names. The tension was not just palpable, it was thick. It's almost military in its stillness. This was not a negotiation, it was a confrontation. and everyone in that room knew it. Israel had been forced into a corner, not by a nuclear power or a European alliance, but by a man they had underestimated, by a soldier who had turned insurgent loyalty into national governance, who had defied the grip of neocolonialism, and who had the audacity to stare down global players without blinking. Traoré's tone was firm, almost surgical. There were no diplomatic flourishes, no vague appeals to shared interests or regional cooperation. He didn't need to talk for long. Every sentence he delivered landed like a hammer. Africa is not a testing ground for foreign intelligence, he said, eyes locked with the envoy across from him. You crossed into our skies, you tapped into our soil. You will now answer to our people. The Israelis remained composed, but the edge in the room cut through their professionalism. They had been briefed extensively on Traoré, his ideological leanings, his alliances, his increasing popularity in the Pan-African movement, but none of that had prepared them for the raw authority he carried in person. He wasn't just speaking as Burkina Faso's interim president. He was speaking as the mouthpiece of a continent fed up with silent exploitation. The heart of the confrontation wasn't just about drones or covert data operations. It was about what those things represented in ongoing attempts to subvert African sovereignty under the banner of security cooperation. For years, foreign actors had used counterterrorism as a license to establish surveillance corridors, resource access points, and paramilitary proxies throughout West Africa. But Traoré had exposed something larger. His forces had intercepted and decoded intelligence that pointed to patterns, joint tech operations involving private contractors with indirect state ties. These weren't just intelligence missions, they were strategic mappings of Africa's future zones of influence. What truly shocked the Israeli delegation was how well-informed Traoré's team had become. Satellite routes, transponder signals, frequency interferences, time-coded flight deviations, every technical detail was documented, cataloged, and backed by intercepted communications. The message was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer blind. Africa was no longer blind. And then, without warning, Traoré dropped the biggest hook of the day. A document slid across the table. It was a decrypted memo, one that had been marked as internal use only by an Israeli-linked cybersecurity firm operating in the Sahel. The memo outlined predictive models assessing regime durability of post-coup governments across West Africa, with risk indexes for each leader. Traoré's name was highlighted in red. His removal was marked medium priority, resolved variable. The room turned cold. No one spoke for a full minute. Traoré leaned forward, his voice lower now. I'm not afraid of threats. Written in air-conditioned rooms thousands of kilometers away, I'm afraid of silence, and I assure you, I am no longer silent. The meeting concluded without press statements, without smiles, and without handshakes. But by the time both delegations left the compound, something irreversible had been set into motion. The balance of fear had shifted. The man once viewed as an unpredictable military officer was now a strategic force, someone who could expose, embarrass, and hold to account those long immune to scrutiny. And while the rest of the world still waited to hear what had really happened in that hidden room, the truth had already begun leaking online, document by document, word by word, frame by frame. Asterisk, the world had barely digested the implications of leaked documents and intercepted operations, when a new twist unfolded, one that would be broadcast not behind closed doors but in front of the entire planet. With little warning, the Israeli government announced that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu would address the nation in a rare joint press conference with members of the Knesset, the military high command, and select members of the Foreign Affairs Council. It was not just a national moment, it was global. Broadcasters from Europe, Africa, Asia, and North America scrambled to carry the feed live. There was no question in anyone's mind. This was about Traoré. The room was lit with deliberate intensity. Netanyahu stood in the center, flanked by men in dark suits and military uniforms bearing the weight of state power. But no matter how choreographed the image was, it could not distract from the tremor in the air. The opening statement was crisp, but the choice of words carried the weight of years of silence now fractured. There are moments, Netanyahu, began when leadership requires not just action, but acknowledgement. When sovereignty, transparency, and truth intersect, we must respond with honesty. The audience was stunned. No ambiguity. No hiding behind layers of political jargon. He was speaking directly to the fire that had been ignited in Africa. And then, he did what no one predicted. He offered a public, direct apology by name to Captain Ibrahim, Traoré, and the people of Burkina Faso. It was a moment that made history feel like it had stopped breathing. We regret that certain operations undertaken by Israeli-linked private entities in the Sahel region may have undermined mutual trust and violated understandings between our states. We extend our respect to the people of Burkina Faso and to its leadership, which has proven resolute in its defense of national dignity. Gasps echoed in global commentary. A sitting Israeli Prime Minister, known for his hardline posture and refusal to concede even rhetorical ground, had just acknowledged wrongdoing on international television, directed at a 36-year-old military leader from one of Africa's most overlooked nations. The apology wasn't just political, it was tectonic. Social media platforms ignited in real time. African voices, long muted by global media bias, surged to the front of the conversation. Posts from Dakar to Nairobi, Lagos to Johannesburg flooded. Timelines. Africa is no longer invisible. This is not just an apology, it's a reckoning. Traoré's image began circulating with captions once reserved for revolutionaries. The man who made giants bow. 1,000 awakenings. Yet beneath the applause, there was a cold undercurrent. Why now? Why this sudden admission? Analysts suspected it was more than regret. It was damage control. Netanyahu's cabinet had likely received classified briefings on just how much Traoré's team had uncovered. The leaked documents weren't just operational, they were reputational. Time bombs. If even a fraction of them went public, they could ignite a continental uprising against foreign surveillance and control. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about Africa standing on the edge of reclaiming its narrative. But even more jarring than the apology was the fact that Netanyahu's address seemed to pause. As though anticipating a response, cameras lingered, commentators whispered. What would Traoré say? Would he even respond? Was he watching? The broadcast cut, but the silence that followed was more deafening than words. Something was coming, something beyond apology, something that couldn't be contained by press releases and podiums. Hours later, as the world refreshed its feeds and waited for Burkina Faso's reaction, Traoré's office released a single-line statement through Pan-African newswire channels. The dignity of our people does not need validation. It demands transformation. The message was sharp, sovereign, and unshaken. He wasn't interested in praise. He was preparing for the next move. And just like that, Netanyahu's apology, which was meant to control the narrative, had instead triggered a new phase. The world had watched a powerful man apologize. Now it would watch what a newly empowered continent would do with it. The world was still reeling from Netanyahu's televised apology when Captain Ibrahim Traoré made his next move, not with retaliation, not with condemnation, but with vision. Just 48 hours after the global broadcast, he appeared before a gathering of African leaders in Addis Ababa at a closed-door summit convened by the African Union. There was no fanfare, no extravagant optics, just the quiet force of presence. But when Traoré stepped onto that modest stage, holding a single brown dossier marked with the insignia of Burkina Faso's newly established National Sovereignty Commission, everyone in the room sensed it. Something was about to change. The dossier was not merely symbolic. Inside were classified summaries of intercepted communications, reports of unauthorized foreign drone activity, and maps showing predictive exploitation zones for rare minerals and energy assets. But Traoré wasn't there to revisit the past. He was there to offer a blueprint. As his voice echoed through the room, calm yet charged, he unveiled a radical new initiative, the new Sahel Doctrine. Not a military campaign, not a protest, a policy comprehensive, multi-layered, and unapologetically pan-African. The room shifted, eyes widened. Delegates exchanged glances. The doctrine proposed a continent-wide coalition, independent of Western influence, with a clear mandate: consolidate African defense capabilities. build an integrated intelligence sharing network, nationalize critical infrastructure, and establish a centralized African digital firewall. No more silent data theft. No more disguised security partnerships that traded autonomy for aid. For decades, Africa had been reacting. Traoré was now proposing that it orchestrate. He didn't speak in abstract ideals. He laid down timelines, logistical frameworks, and even outlined the need for a continent-tone satellite monitoring system that would neutralize the need for Western surveillance tools. The boldest hook of all came when he declared the launch of the African Sovereign Data Bank, a decentralized AI-powered repository that would process all cross-border digital data flows within Africa, outlawing foreign storage of sensitive national information without oversight. This was more than cybersecurity. It was digital liberation. The audience remained quiet, but the atmosphere was electric. Many in the room had felt the humiliation of being surveilled, overruled, and overlooked by foreign intelligence actors who operated with impunity. Traoré had given those emotions a form, a structure, and a plan. And it wasn't just about defense. He detailed an economic framework tethered to the doctrine joint currency discussions, mineral exchange protocols, and a proposal for an African-only blockchain network to handle resource trading in a way that bypassed SWIFT, IMF bottlenecks, and Western regulatory chokeholds. What made his message resonate so deeply was that it wasn't just revolutionary, it was responsible. Traoré didn't posture as a warlord or dictator. He spoke like a statesman. He acknowledged the complexity of implementing such a doctrine across 50-plus nations, the diplomatic pressures that would arise, and the internal corruption that could compromise the plan. But he looked every delegate in the eye and said, "If we do not architect our sovereignty, it will be written for us in code. In skies we cannot control, in contracts we cannot read." Outside the summit, word of the doctrine spread like wildfire. African youth movements, Pan-African academics, and civil society leaders began demanding public adoption. Graffiti appeared in Dakar. "We are not your data," in Kampala. "Sahel Doctrine equals African future." It wasn't just policy, it was a cultural ignition. Netanyahu's apology in hindsight had been the spark. But Traoré's doctrine was the flame that refused to be put out. The story had shifted. No longer was the world focused on who had intruded where. Now the attention was on who had responded with a vision powerful enough to reshape an entire continent's destiny. Doctrine had not just redefined Africa's position, it had unsettled global power in real time.